Hi everybody. In this video demonstration, I am going to be walking you through the first stages of building your whistle using the pinch technique. So even though some of the ideas that I have sketched down have pointed edges, I'm still going to use the same technique using a rounded shape in order to create the pinch pots. So I'm going to be using what's called the pinch technique. This is one of our final techniques that you're going to be learning in this class before we move on to glazing. And the pinch technique is basically what it says. You're going to be pinching the clay so that it stretches and moves and creates circular forms. The whistle that I'm holding right here is an example using the pinch technique. So by now you've already completed your plan. You have your final sketch with the front view, top view, and where the spout should go. That should be in front of you during the entire building process. I'm going to be giving you your clay, and you're not going to start with the entire block. You need to take a look at your hands, and that's really going to decide how much clay you can or cannot work with. So the shape of my hand, I can hold a fair amount of clay here. I can't hold this entire block because my hands are not that big. So I'm going to show you what will happen if I try to attempt to create a pinch project using my hands and this entire block of clay. It's kind of going to get away from me because as you pinch, the clay starts to stretch and it starts to move upward. So if I'm working with clay that I can't control or I'm working with too much, my shape is going to be not so great. So I really want to make sure that I'm creating equal amounts and getting those prepped before I move on to building my pinch pots. So right now I'm separating the clay and I'm wedging it and getting it shaped up. I'm going to use the table to help me kind of build this back into a block so that I can then separate it and I can start creating my pinch pots. So I'm going to divide this in half, and even still, when I divide it in half, it may be a little bit too much, so I'm going to test out the amount that I have in my hand before I start to build with the clay. And so when you start with this technique, there's a couple of things that you want to keep in mind. You want to keep in mind how big you want your project to be. So again, we're going to be using measurements with this. In the cube project, I measured out a template, a 5x5 template. With the coil project, you were able to kind of measure out how big you wanted to make your project, so the base and the height, as well as the width. You're also going to be doing the same thing here with this project. So I know that I want my whistle to be a decent size, not too small. So I'm going to set my clay aside in a damp paper towel just to kind of keep it from drying out while I figure out the measurements of my project. So using a ruler, I'm going to take a look at my ruler in comparison to my drawing, and I'm going to start thinking about the base of this project and the width that I want this to be. I don't want my project to get any bigger than this because then it's hard to work with. The pinch technique, you kind of want to keep your projects fairly small because they're easier to work with. So I want this to be about 3.5 inches wide. I want it to be about 3 inches tall. It might be a little bit taller than that. And then the depth I want this to be is no more than about 2 inches or so. I could even maybe push it to like 3 inches if I wanted to. But for right now, I'm going to measure this to be about 3.5 inches long, 3 inches tall, and 2 inches deep. So now that I've got all my measurements in place, I'm going to start kind of mapping out how much clay I'm going to work with. Now, when you start with your building of your pinch project, you want to prep your 2 pieces of clay first instead of grabbing a ball of clay, shaping it, and then trying to figure out how much clay you use to begin with. So I'm going to divide the clay in half, set my other piece aside, and so I'm going to kind of shape this into my hands, and then I'm going to pull a little bit more away because I kind of have to gauge how much is going to stretch to about 3.5 inches. So knowing that I only need a little bit of clay to stretch this to 3.5 inches, I want to make sure that I don't grab too much. So I'm cupping my hands and I'm taking the clay in between my hands and kind of giving it a firm press into the palms of my hands. So it's really important, the shape of your hand. If I keep my hand flat and I hit the clay up against my flat hand, it's never going to create a circle. It's going to kind of look flat on one side, or it's going to create an oval shape. I really want to make sure that I start with a circular shape. If you have a shape that isn't circular when you start the pinch project, you're going to have a really hard time as you get going with this to shape it back how you want it. It's going to take you more time to correct the mistakes that you made in the beginning. So it's really important to get this right in the first stages. So as you can see, I'm kind of pulling some of the clay away because just by shaping this, I know that as I pinch this, it's going to stretch and it's going to become bigger than I want it to be. Because remember, this is only one side. So technically this should only be about 1.25 inches. So you'll take a little bit of time to get practice with this because it is your first time working on this technique. I've had a lot of practice. I've been able to eye my projects pretty well. So I know that small amount of clay that I have right there will be a good shape to create the half of my 3.5. So now I want to take my second part of my clay and I want to shape it to be the same exact size as that circle. Now, this is what I'm talking about when I say that you want to make sure that you complete this step first, because if you try to go back and match your clay after you've already created the pinch pot, it's really hard to match. And you can spend more time, trimming, going back and reshaping. So you really want to make sure that your two circles that you're going to be creating are exactly the same size. So as I'm looking at these, I can tell one of these is a little bit bigger than the other. And you can continue to kind of pull clay away, reshape it. You want to make sure that you spend time kind of looking at these first before you start building. So just like we did with our tiles when we created our cube, you really want to make sure that your tiles are the correct size before you start building them, or else you're going to have sides that don't match. So for the same thing with the pinch project, you want to make sure your pinch pieces of clay are the same size before you start. So I'm going to create 2 half circles. So I need to open these up and I'm going to use my thumb to do that. But I want to make sure that I dip my thumb in some water so that when I stick my thumb into the clay, it doesn't stick. I want to be able to push into the clay, pull my thumb out, and not have any clay come back with me. So I'm going to place it into my hand. I'm going to find the center of the ball of clay. I'm going to use a good amount of force to push my thumb into the clay. Now, girls who have long nails, you may struggle with this and somebody may have to help you because you don't want to push all the way through, but you also don't want your base to be too thick. So I'm just going to start by pushing through the clay, but I'm not going to go all the way through. I want to stop when I can feel about 1/4 inch or a pencil thickness. If I push all the way through, then I have to start all over again. So I kind of twist my thumb out of the pinch project, and now I can start the pinching portion of this. So I'm going to keep my thumb in the center. I'm going to wrap my 4 fingers around the outside and I'm going to start to pinch my project as I turn my project. Now I want you to take note. I'm keeping my project in my hand because I want to cup the bottom of this because I want to start with a rounded shape. So even if my project is like a square, I'm still going to start with a round shape, and then after I've opened up the pinch pot and cleaned it up, then I will shape it back to the rectangle or cube, whatever shape I want. But it has to start as a rounded shape. So as you can see, I've pinched all the way around and I want to make sure that my sides are about a pencil thickness. So as it is right now, this pinch project is a little too thick, so I need to go back and I need to pinch it a little bit more. You want to make sure that as you're pinching this, that you're keeping it consistent, that you're not over pinching certain areas and then not pinching enough in some. You have to make sure that this is even. Another trick that I do is once I've opened this and I have enough room, I stick both my thumbs into the pinch project and I flip it upside down into the pinch pot. And I start to kind of press and pull. So a pinch and pull technique where I'm kind of wrapping my hands around it and pinching as I rotate the clay in my hands. This creates a really even and consistent wall to my project, and that's what I'm looking for. So if your project starts to kind of lose its shape or it gets a little bit too wide, you can always kind of compress it by lightly pressing it against the table. Now again, I'm not going to take it and slam it into the table. I don't want to do that because it'll wreck the shape of my pinch project. I just want to lightly drop it onto the table while I cup my hands around it to flatten out the edge. And I'm just kind of lightly dropping it onto the table as I turn it. I'm letting the table kind of help me with the shape. And so as you can see, I've created a flat edge because I'm going to have to stick these two pinch projects together. So I want to make sure they have a flat surface to connect to. It's really hard to kind of connect two projects that have a rounded edge. So I always want to make sure that even though my project is round, I have a flat edge to stack them. So as you can see, this is the left half of my project. So I'm a little bit over my mark at about 1 3/4. But for right now, this is a pretty good size. So now I'm going to do the same exact thing to my other ball of clay. I'm going to stick my thumb into the water and I'm going to repeat the steps. I'm going to cup it into my hand, place my thumb in the center, and I'm not going to push all the way through. I just want to make sure that I'm pushing to about 1/4 of an inch thickness. And I'm going to turn my thumb so I can take it out of the pinch project. And now I can start my pinching. And all I'm doing is pinching all the way around. So you want to make sure that you're not just completing 1 or 2 passes around the pinch project and leaving it really thick. You have to really work to make your sides consistent and even. And when I say consistent and even, what I mean is it has to be the same thickness all the way around. So kind of like you can think about your coils, you can think about your cube. All your coils had to be the same kind of thickness. Your tiles had to be the same kind of thickness. Your pinch pots have to be the same kind of thickness. So that is key in building this project, is making sure that the walls of your pinch pots are even. You don't want one pinch pot that's way bigger than the other, because then your project will also dry uneven and it can create cracking. And if I fire it and it's not dried at the same time, it could blow up. So now what I'm doing is I'm just going back and I'm kind of cleaning up the edges again, following the same steps that I did for my first pinch pot. I'm just kind of lightly pressing areas that I see that are thicker than the other. So you may have to, kind of hold your pinch pot in front of you, take a look at the shape, analyze what it looks like, assess what it looks like, and see if there are areas that are thicker or thinner than others. And if there are areas that are thicker, then you need to pinch them a little bit more. If there are areas that are thinner, you may need to add back a little bit of clay. And I'll show you how to do that in the next video when we connect our two pinch pots together. So as you can see looking at these, they are pretty much the same size and pretty consistent. I can still kind of flatten out my edges a little bit, and I'm just going to compare them now that I have both of them. I'm looking at the sides of the walls, looking for any areas that are thinner than others, any areas that are thicker, and I'm going to make adjustments accordingly. Now I'm going to measure this. So this one's a little bit bigger, but that's okay. I can still kind of trim it a little bit, and I can even stretch it a little bit more and compress it to make it the size that I want it to be. I can even adjust my size a little bit too. I don't want this to be too small that it's hard to work with, but I also don't want it to be so big that the size has gotten away from me and it's hard to work with as well. So if I put these two together and I kind of compare it to my draft of my drawing, the size is pretty good. This is what I'm aiming for. So I feel like I hit the mark. I'm going to now clean them up and make adjustments where needed. So now since I have my two pinch pots that are ready to go and they're clean and even. I want to make sure that they get to a leather hard stage before I connect them. So I'm now going to show you a couple of things you don't want to do with your pinch project. You always want to make sure that you have water on your thumb. If you don't, your thumb's going to get stuck in there. But when you press through, you don't want to push all the way through, or you don't want to leave this so thin that it begins to crack. So you don't want to take your thumb and push it all the way through to where you feel the palm of your hand. That means you've gone too far. If you pinch your two fingers along the inside and you can feel the base and the inside, you'll be able to tell if it's a pencil thickness. If you pull your hands away and it's, more than a half of an inch, then it's too much. You don't want to set it on the table either while you're pinching it, because then your edge gets really flat and we don't want that. We want a really round edge for our project. So some of you might get tempted to set it on the table while you pinch. You don't want to do that. You want to make sure that it's flipped upside down over your thumbs and that your fingers are on the outside. Also, if you set it on the table, it can also create a really thick base, and you don't want that either. So some people get overly eager with their pinching and they create really thin areas and really thick areas. You don't want that either, because it's really hard to go back and fix this. It takes a lot of time. You might as well just start over, because having to go back and add clay to areas that are thinner, smooth it all out, compress it, it just takes a really long time. So if you do it right the first time, you don't have to spend as much time fixing your mistakes that you made in a rush. So you do want to take your time a little bit with creating the first part of the pinch pots. So if you look at the walls in comparison, you can see on the left it's even, all the walls are the same size all the way around. On the right, it's patchy, there's areas that are thinner, some areas that are thicker, there's no real flat base, or excuse me, flat edge. It's not so great. So to correct it, you want to make sure that you're doing like a pinching and pulling motion, and you can compress this. So I am going to show you how to correct it a little bit, so that you can try and fix it. You want to wrap your hands around it and you kind of want to pull them together. So you don't want to smush your project, you're just kind of lightly compressing your project in your hands. And at first it's going to look a little bit, not so great, but you can always correct it. What I'm doing when I'm compressing this clay is I'm pushing the smaller, weaker areas together and connecting them to the thicker areas. Again, I have to spend a little bit more time doing this, but this is a fix if your pinch pot got a little bit too wide and it got away from you. So as you can see, there's a little bit of fold over as well when you compress. So you have to make sure that you really smooth those out and that there's not any air underneath those folds. So I'm just compressing this in my hands. I'm just kind of lightly squeezing it in between my palms, but I'm not squeezing it so much that it's collapsing. And then I'm flipping it over and I'm using the table to kind of help me flatten out that edge and smooth out the edge. So now I'm just going back to the areas that I've compressed and I'm just smoothing them and trying to fix them the best that I can. But as you can see, in the time that it's taking me to fix these mistakes, I could have already made a clean and correct pinch pot. So while it will take you a little bit of practice at first to get used to the pinch technique, you can still fix, the shape of your pinch pot if you need to, but you really want to focus on kind of getting it right the first time. And it may not happen the first time, which is fine, but as you get used to this technique, it's a really helpful technique in very quickly making half circles or circular forms for whatever it is you want to create for your projects. But again, you want to make sure that you're pinching it correctly when you first start, or else you're going to have to spend extra time going back to compress it, flatten it, smooth it out, and shape it all over again. So as I look at this right now, I've corrected it. I've smoothed out the sides, I've fixed the edges, and now I can kind of go back and repinch in the areas that I need to. Now another thing is your hand placement. So I'm going to kind of mess up this pinch pot again so you can see what I'm talking about. If you pinch in the position that I have my hands where my fingers are inside the pinch bowl and not on the outside, it's really going to mess up the shape of your pinch project because you have to wrap your fingers around the outside of the pinch pot and use your thumb as the guide on the inside. So it's more of like the fingers on the outside are supporting the pinching on the inside. If you pinch the opposite way, it creates big dips in the side and it also creates uneven sides. So it's really important to make sure that your thumb is on the inside and your fingers are wrapped around the outside. So there you have it. Now with these two pinch pots, I can go ahead and score and slip these, attach them and blend them, and I'm going to add a support coil around it. And I will show you how to do that in the next video demonstration.